Virtually every leader in the health freedom movement talks about the insecurity of the food supply as one of the primary avenues of tyranny. Our family has rigorously sourced our foods for over a decade, and one of our favorite sources is Farm Match. And specifically, if you are in San Diego, Real Food Club PMA. My kids are literally made from their maple breakfast sausage and the amazing carnitas we make from their pasture-raised pork. But from regeneratively raised raw dairy products to the organic potato chips made in regenerative lard or anything you might get at your local farmer's market, our family's overall wellness and the security of our food lies in the hands of Farm Match and Real Food Club. I am so excited to be sharing about Farm Match and Real Food Club to offer Future Generations podcast listeners 10% off your first order. You can find the code and link in the show notes. Enjoy the rest of the show. Love and appreciate you all. The desire to go off-grid and disconnect from the system was one of the single most important initiatives any household could have. Whether it is growing our own food, becoming sovereign in our energy production and usage, establishing alternative communication strategies, or digging a well and finding the infinity of primary water. About a year and a half ago, our family moved into our new home in North County, San Diego on 3 acres of precious land here in America's finest county. One of the first things we did was hire Food Forest Abundance to design a regenerative layout for our land. From the different trees to plant differing berry guilds and synergistic pollinators, to consulting on alternative energy, collecting our rainwater, and even helping us find our local well guy, Food Forest Abundance and their Freedom Farm Academy has been pivotal in the gradual and consistent evolution of our household towards true sovereignty from the system. They have helped us simplify a very confusing process and helped us create the design of our dreams. It doesn't matter if you have 3 acres, dozens or hundreds, or just a small yard. Food Forest Abundance has something to offer you and your family in your journey to move your entire household off-grid. Use the code TheFutureGen to work with the absolute best in the world, Food Forest Abundance, to create your own freedom farm and get off-grid at a discounted rate. Welcome to another episode of the Future Generations podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Stanton Hom, and this episode is one of the most pragmatic episodes that I've ever done to see radical transformation in a community that largely is experiencing one of the highest trajectory growths of chronic illness in the history of the world. Our kids in public school. Dr. Lona Cook, an amazing chiropractor from the Midwest, somebody who I've been inspired by, I've shared the stage with on multiple platforms. And in the end, she is putting her money where her mouth is and showing with some of the greatest scientists in natural health, but especially chiropractic with Dr. Heidi, the transformative power of chiropractic care as it relates to brain function, as it relates to neurodevelopmental trends, as it relates to neurobehavioral function, as it relates to the nervous system's ability to self-heal and self-regulate. It is trending today to talk about the nervous system. It is trending today to talk about the vagus nerve. It's trending today to talk about the prefrontal cortex. And it's another thing to recognize that the mind-body connection, as it's aspired to talk about by so many influencers, has been safeguarded by a profession for over 125 years in chiropractic, especially as it relates to our kids who are facing the greatest epidemic of all time. Dr. Lona Cook, thank you. Amazing episode, so inspiring. I hope you enjoy this episode. Please share it far and wide with those people in your world who have kids who are experiencing some of these big issues, because there's hope, there's possibility, and there's healing. Love and appreciate you all. Enjoy this episode. Welcome to the Future Generations podcast, providing you with the world-changing content necessary to inspire you, your family, and our planet to a life of optimal health potential. We'll help you make the choices that powerfully influence the lives you bring into this world. It's time to strengthen our resolve, do better now, and for our future generations. I'm your host, Dr. Stanton Hom. Okay, welcome to another episode of the Future Generations podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Stanton Hom. I have a very special guest, somebody I've been inspired by for a long time, somebody who I've shared the stage with one big time at one big idea by the one of the most amazing people, Dr. Devin Verana in Kansas. Well, where were we? Wichita, Kansas. I just remember it was 2021 and it was crazy. Dr. Lona Cook, you are an amazing chiropractor. You're somebody who I listen to on podcasts, somebody I watch on social media. And then I saw a post recently about some of the work that you're doing infrastructurally for some of the most amazing high needs population, our kids in the school systems that I talk ad nauseum about. I would love our audience to get to know you both professionally and personally. So please introduce yourself.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Dr. Stan.
Of course.
I love Dr. Devin. She's amazing. It's such a catalyst for so many things. So, I've professionally been a chiropractor for 14 years, which is sort of crazy because I'm sure you're not too far behind, or maybe
13,
you're right around
actually 14. Yeah, as of last week. Yep.
And it's like, whoa, I feel like sometimes it's been like 2 years and other times it feels like a lifetime. But one of the things we've been blessed with is, and what we're going to talk about, I'm sure today, is we have a traditional brick and mortar practice that evolved also into having a practice that operates in our public school system, bringing chiropractic care into our public school setting to help facilitate care and help all the benefits we know that we see in children in our office, as well as adults, because the staff can get adjusted as well, bring that into the school setting to help kids hopefully engage and thrive in the educational setting, or at least improve in their ability to, be in their day-to-day life and engage with classmates better and stay in their classes in a way that maybe before there was more behaviors or more outbursts, more missed days in school. And so we're looking at all of these things from a point of, as their nervous system is better regulated, how can we see the benefits in an education setting as it relates to chiropractic and bringing it to the kids. So that's a cool thing we're doing. But I also still practice in our brick and mortar. I love speaking, and I love this idea of too that, and it's been more clear and like concise in my mind lately than ever, is that those of us who carry a vision, and I love the name of your podcast, Future Generations. When you can see things, like you can see that it could be different, or you can see that there's potential that we're not tapping into, using our voices and our hearts and our minds to latch on to that is a lot of what I think pulls it into reality.
Of course.
And I just realized as we're in this time of so much change, that those of us that can just hold that grid work essentially of like what is possible, and then walk that out and do it with a strong root and faith in that, like people are hungry for those messages. And I see it in our own community as we've created a fair amount of change, and we're in the, times of even more change. We had a hospital system around us that's been here for many, many decades just implode, and everybody's looking for new solutions. And I realized, like, chiropractic, vitalism, some of these things that have ideas that are different than what we've gotten used to in Western healthcare. I'm like, this is the time for us to like stand up and project. And people are interested. Not everyone, but a lot of people are. So I feel excited about that. Personally, I have 2 little boys at home, and actually I have 3 older stepdaughters too. My husband's an electrician, so he turns power on in a different way. But that's us. So we live in Wisconsin. I just love chiropractic. It transformed my own worldview and how I do almost anything in my life, and really opened my mind to see. And so that for me is why I feel called to help other people connect in whatever way that they're meant to connect in, whether that's as a patient or as, someone who works in a chiropractic practice, but maybe not the chiropractor, or developing more offices that can serve more of, humanity. And now with what we're doing in the public schools, we hope more schools, kind of catch fire to this.
I love that. It's, I teach a lot of workshops in the community, and some are, the demographic is like their literacy in natural health, self-healing, chiropractic is limited. And some, we teach more advanced workshops. We teach vaccine workshops, informed consent workshops, and those families are more like their acumen for these kind of practices is very high. And I've been like polling the audience lately because we know, because we study and we see the trends, and we watch our kids, and we see chiropractic kids, and we see, Gen Pop kids, and no shame or marginalization in any capacity, but we see the trends. 1 in 6 kids has some sort of neurodevelopmental disorder. In the American public school systems, like 1 in 4 requires some sort of special education, special needs. And you talk to any educator and of any tenure, and they know that there's this epidemic that's of wild proportions that humanity has never seen before. And when I poll the audience and I say, hey, we have more doctors, we have more pharma, we have more natural resources, even to some degree. And the statistics that I'm sharing about are 10 to 12 years old. Is it better or worse now? And both audience reflexively, no hesitation, it's worse now. Mm-hmm. And a lot of us talk about that. A lot of us see miracles in our practice. And then some people take it a step further and they start to see, hey, like, let's go into these communities where we know these teachers are having a hard time, these kids are having a hard time, these parents are having a hard time, and we could put all the numbers and statistics as we want to, and we can talk about all the trends and all the epidemiological research, but there's a kid and a parent and a teacher and an environment behind that that has hard transitions, that has behavior stuff, that has learning stuff, and it rehumanizes it. And then there's a special population like you that says, hey, I think we could do something about this, and hey, maybe we could bring in the best chiropractic scientist in the world, and before we get to the details, I think I do want to know maybe your chiropractic story. I want to know like what catalyzed you, what inspired you, what brought you, into this thing that you've done for over a decade and have essentially just created so much amazing waves of radical transformation for your community.
I thought I think I was in 11th grade when I realized I think I want to be a chiropractor. And I grew up getting adjusted periodically. And I knew that I actually had gotten my first adjustment as a baby because I was colicky. And my dad's family had utilized chiropractic, and he convinced my mom she needs to get adjusted. So then, of course, they started getting all of us adjusted. But I didn't take it much further than that, and I didn't know much more. And what was interesting, so I went to school, didn't do a lot of research, just knew that was what I was going to do. And I went to a not very philosophical school, which is neither here nor there. But I remember the first day of school, the chancellor or whoever he was spoke, and he said, this is a tough profession because you're always having to tell people why they have to come back. And I remember sitting in my chair thinking, I looked around, did anyone else hear him? Did he misspeak? I didn't understand what the problem was. I'm like, it's not too complex to understand that you take care of your spine. Just I don't think in the first day of dentistry school, they tell the dentist that,
Right.
And so it just was like my paradigm was not that, because I didn't grow up in that. I thought everyone had chiropractors. I had no idea my family was maybe different. And what I found out later after I had graduated, I was in practice, and I had a grandfather, he's now passed, he was a veterinarian, and he was kind of a hard ass. And maybe I'm not supposed to swear on this podcast.
You're good.
Okay. So he was an interesting cat, and he had grown up, was like an orphaned kid at a young age, and was in the time where he would have been born in 1919, I believe. And so he lived in a boarding home when he was in his 15, 16-year-old. And he was in a car accident. I found this out all later because he called me and told me this. He was in a car accident and he got knocked unconscious, and one of the other passengers in the car died. And so whoever came upon this wreck, again, this would have been in the 30s, I think, said does anyone know this kid? And they said, yeah, he doesn't have any family here. He lives in the boarding home, but the chiropractor in town knows him. So they took my grandfather to the chiropractor, And apparently he stayed in that office for 3 days, not fully like conscious.
Wow.
And the guy checked and adjusted him, and he woke up and walked out on the third day, and he said, and I was fine. And so I laughed when he told me the story. I was like, it never occurred to you to tell me this story before, because I was already deep into chiropractic.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, that's the craziest story I've heard. But it also made me realize, I said, do you remember when you first got adjusted? He's like, no, but I know when my mom was still living with me, she took me and my brothers to the chiropractor because she didn't have money for the medical doctor, and she knew that we did not get as sick if we would get adjusted. And it just like blew my mind, because I realized, okay, we've been adjusted for like 4 or 5 generations in my family at that point. And so that was in my DNA. And then I go to chiropractic school, I come out, I'm building a practice. And I think I instinctually just knew I loved adjusting, and I didn't want to do nutrition and some of these other things a lot. I just wanted to like focus on the adjustment. And I had a mentor who said, like, when you get squeezed, what comes out? And I said, what do you mean? He's like, well, if you squeeze an orange, orange juice is supposed to come out. It's not apple juice. And he's like, you're a chiropractor. You need to like really get into the philosophy of chiropractic and understanding like what it really means when you hear like universal intelligence, innate intelligence, life force, energy, like all of that. And so I just went on a mission to go deeper and deeper. And I think simultaneously in my own life, I started to witness things from a different perspective. And I think that I like woke up, if you will, to like life is really happening through me, and how the tone of my nervous system was connected to like everything happening around me. And then later on, I got to witness kind of like the depths of human suffering, because my mom was in and out of like mental institutions and really horrific experiences that I never in a million years would have thought that she would have been in that predicament for her own health. But it taught me also that, the grace and the like capacity to like walk with people when they're in really tough situations, and that it on some level could happen to anyone. I think that birthed me into a different position too, where I just realized like we are here to help each other. And sometimes like we don't necessarily know what another person needs, but we can be with them, and hold space for what they choose or don't choose for that matter, which I think is a lot of doing good healing work, is realizing like my agenda can't be placed on you.
I love that.
Because the healing has to come from within you, right? And that is crucial for us to understand. In chiropractic, we talk about like who really does the healing. Like you give the adjustment, but the other person's innate is what does the work, right? But in Western medicine, we have that all garbled up, and we take people's power in that process. So
it's for our audience, mostly we're parents. I would say there's largely we get feedback, and a lot of people do have chiropractors. A lot of people might be a little bit naive to some of the terminology, and so it's essentially like chiropractic is so it's if you study chiropractic at its purest source, it is one of the single most beautiful expressions of any human like creation in the history of time. And that's obviously both of us being radically biased, but also because we have studied through those lenses, that when you recognize like the miracles that we have, like eye to eye, heart to heart, hand, like literally in our hands, and what we would say innate to innate, they're absolutely undeniable. And then you listen to podcasts and you see these platforms and you talk about influencers and biohackers and self-healing and vagus nerve and prefrontal cortex and autonomic regulation, all these things that people are like these trending conversations.
Right.
You read our old textbooks and you can see like people from the 1800s, the early 1900s, the forefathers and mothers, because a lot of foremothers in chiropractic, we talked about it. We knew how to dance with it. We knew how to inspire it. And so when you go to a chiropractor, you never know, right? Like people who go to chiropractic for back pain, neck pain, headaches, car accidents, a lot of things insurance pays for, et cetera, not to blame anybody or marginalize anybody. But one of my friends would always say, it's like going to the gas station for coffee. It's a nice side effect, right? To get better spinal comfort, right? But the root of it is this nervous system thing that is, it's just the seed of human potential and human consciousness. And so when we talk about philosophical chiropractors, vitalistic chiropractors, what we're subscribing to is a model of chiropractic that essentially inspires this radical self-healing and self-regulation of the nervous system. That is a very modern thing. We talked about before we hit record that the population, those of you who are listening, you are way more ready for chiropractic than honestly many chiropractors are ready to serve you. And what we're going to talk about is how Dr. Cook is essentially like navigating in this, treacherous landscape from a clinical perspective. Like most Western docs, most pediatricians have no concept of where the root cause of these issues that are afflicting our kids relies. And honestly, like, I can't wait to chat more about it, because I think what you're doing is putting your money where your mouth is. You grow an amazing practice. You're very well known in the profession for that. And then you also know that there's a subpopulation of people that may not have access to the care in a certain model that you're providing for in a different place. And you're serving them, and you are literally showing like dramatic transformations, not only in their lives in real time, but you're building science around it, which is amazing. And so I'd love to hear a little bit more about that, because I think it's such an amazing opportunity to just talk about the depth of what we do.
Thank you. That was a great way to thank you for unpacking it. So I'm sorry about that, because I am in my chiro bubble all the time.
It's okay. It's okay. No, I think that's important, because I think most people who listen don't realize how much they love what we do already. They just don't always know what it is.
Yeah. Amen.
Capacity.
I think that's been my experience within the public schooling, is, I was telling you that how the project began, it was just like, I'll kind of take it back. So as I said, I was going deeper in understanding this philosophy that, like, Dr. Stan just beautifully unpacked some of that right there. And I was at a seminar where a chiropractor from Puerto Rico was having us go through a visualization. And he said, I want you to close your eyes, and I want you to think about, what does the world look like, feel like? What do we experience it like if the majority of the world knew some of the things we knew, to the point that the way we engage in schooling our children had radically changed? And instead of something like, hey, have you gotten your vaccines before you are enrolled in public school? It was like, hey, has your nervous system been checked by a chiropractor? Has your child's nervous system had a tune-up? And he had us do this visualization, right? And I'm in a room with like some of the most philosophical chiropractors in the profession. And I was new. I was like 3 years in. I was just trying to get like immersed in it. But I remember thinking while he was saying it, I thought, like, that sounds great, but that's not going to happen. Like, that was my exact thoughts in my mind. And I grew up with public school educators as parents, and again, like, it was just my limitation of thinking that. But at the same time, so he had us open our eyes, and he said, okay, who can see it? And of course, every hand goes up in the room, because of course you don't want to be the one that's like, I can't see that. And then he said, if you can't, and he said, shame on you, you're part of the problem. Wow. And it hit me because I was realizing, I was reading like, Bruce Lipton and Joe Dispenza and Lynn McTaggart's work on like the field and where do your thoughts exist and how do things drop in and consciousness. And I realized, oh my gosh, he is right. Like, if we can't envision something bigger than what we've currently got going on, like, it's never going to happen. And it doesn't cost us anything to start expanding the possibility instead of thinking about all the reasons why it won't happen. And so he said in the next sentence, he said, the drug companies don't have trouble thinking this big for our children. So why do we? And I thought, just blew my mind. And I went back to practice, and you maybe feel this sometimes too, where like, there's something like marinating in you. And I know I'm supposed to do something, or there's something that I felt a little frustrated about, but I didn't know what it was. And I feel like the urge just kept coming of like, you're not playing big enough. Like, you're not influencing where you could influence. And I thought like, well, I don't have the time that I had before was like immersed in practice, but maybe I can go to some of the people who are very influential in our community. And, it opened a door for me to start to think about the district from a different perspective. They're generally one of the largest employers in the area, as well as they obviously carry immense influence on the families. And I had a degree of knowledge of the superintendent at the time, and we had a good relationship. And so I just reached out to her and was very transparent that I also knew from my parents being public educators and what was going on in the political realm in the state of Wisconsin that there was a lot of changes that were going to be hard on the district that were happening. And so I just said, hey, I don't know if you've ever considered bringing, something in like chiropractic to support the educators, but I know they're probably more stressed than ever. And I'd love to talk to you about, how this could be of a benefit. And this was back in like 2016, 2017. And she, received the conversation, said, I'd love for you to have a conversation with the HR department and let you guys just discuss more about what you see and how you could see that working. And so we went through a series of meetings. Obviously, nothing opened up quickly. And I sat in rooms at times where they're having wellness conversations, quote unquote, about flu vaccination and things like that. And I just kept my mouth shut and I listened. I was listening, and I think that was one of the biggest eye openers for me. As I realized that my place was to be anchored in what chiropractic could provide as a tool, and
Totally.
And to not like set myself on fire necessarily for other reasons yet. Yeah, no, I get it. And I wanted to, but I also realized like I'm going to sit at the table here right now. And so they actually ran a poll for the teachers, and they're a district of 600 plus, teachers and support staff. And so chiropractic was on their top 5 of like 20 things that the district said, would you want this type of support brought into you? And so that was positive. And so they decided they were going to try it. And so, it wasn't glamorous. I packed up my like portable table, my portable stuff. I like brought paperwork there. And we began in 2017. And it was about a year later that one of the admin came to me, and she's funny. She doesn't mince words. So she was like, hey, why can't we do this with the students? And I was like, well, what do you mean? She's like, why can't we bring chiropractic in for the students? And I said, I don't know. You tell me. And she's like, I am telling you, that's my job. I'm the pupil services director. And I think we should start this with the kids. And I said, oh my gosh, okay, let me call some of my mentors. Cause I personally didn't feel prepared at that moment. Like I was like, this is a big district. How are we going to do this? Who are we going to start with? How are we going to talk to the parents? But what I realized in the next years to come was that the district was far more prepared for this than we were. Like they already were bringing in mental health. They employ PT and OTs. They bring in lots of things, especially to support some of the students who are like the most underserved or with the highest needs. And so it wasn't radical for them to think about making this type of contract with an outside party that they could bring in. It was more for us professionally. Like it was like, well, I don't know anyone doing this. And so as I kind of got my ducks in a row, we began with 20 students at one of the elementary schools. There's 9 schools here. And as you can imagine, it showed positive responses. And so I remember we stopped before the end of the year with doing the adjustments weekly with these kids. And one of the special ed department teachers had called or emailed, and she's like, you need to come back. Like, don't do that again. Don't stop. And so it just solidified that they wanted us there. We moved on to doing like the second school. And then, I realized quickly that this wasn't sustainable for me. I still had a brick and mortar practice, and I was running around like a chicken with my head cut off to the different schools. And I did have an associate when we began, but I realized we need a full-time person devoted to the schools if this keeps growing. And so, I brought on another chiropractor, and she eventually became my business partner in the school-based practice, which now has grown to like levels where it matches the traditional practice. And we just brought on 2 more chiropractors, and we're in 3 districts, and we helped another district just start. Unreal. Yeah. So it seems to me that when you come with ideas and solutions and really like transparency of like, it especially wasn't for us. We didn't know, we didn't know how this would go over. We didn't know if the parents would want it. We didn't know how invasive it would be to the kids' school day. But, Dr. Stan, as you and I both know, like, it doesn't take very long to get adjusted. So on some level, like, they don't miss much class to come down and lay on a chiropractic table and receive a chiropractic adjustment and go back to class. So the district on some level just needed to better understand, like, what would this look like, and what are the benefits? And so we obviously had to be educating both the parents and the teacher and the support staff, which is a process, but it is crazy how it's like just blown up as we've been in the culture longer and figure out how to really fit into their ecosystem. And so Heidi, our research team, Dr. Heidi Havoc, who is out of New Zealand, and Emron, her counterpart, who's a PhD, and their team, they got involved with us in 2018. And she was at a similar conference to me, and I was telling her what we were doing, and like her jaw dropped, and she was like, "I want to write that research." And I was like, "Don't tease me." She's like, "I'm not. We're going to do this with you." So, they were actually all here. So we had Life University from Atlanta, Georgia, and 2 of their research team, and then Heidi and her 3 research team with her up here in March. And we just ran a feasibility trial with a small subset of our students to see, they're looking at the brain function and as it relates to, we know that children are able, from like seeing the outcomes in their day-to-day, we know they're able to engage in school differently. We know that their behaviors change, but it's like, why does that happen? Right. And so she's going to help us determine, like, when they get adjusted, what are some of the changes that are happening, and why does, an adjustment in their cervical spine change their brain, so, that's not my realm. I just feel like this project has felt like led the whole way, where it's like the right people kind of show up at the right time. And there were moments like that were very challenging. My license got turned into the board when we were like a year and a half in, by another chiropractor, of course.
Of course.
And I looked at it like, okay, I can either back down and realize that, like, not everyone wants to see this thrive, and maybe I should just go back to the traditional model. Or I can use this as a springboard to say, like, all of our ducks need to be in a row. We need to realize we're always going to be under scrutiny. So my paperwork needs to be flawless. And we just used it as that. And so I realized, like, okay, I'm going to send all the paperwork in that they were asking for. And of course, later on, 18 months later, the complaint got thrown out and it was fine. But it was one of those things where you're just like, oh, do I really want to keep going? I think I'm going to keep going. And I'm so glad that we did. And yeah.
So many people have asked me what I do to stay mentally and physically resilient in the midst of the unending polarization, fear, and tyranny. Literally nothing has made a bigger impact for me than daily cold plunging. 3 minutes, 37 degrees every morning for over a year now. My friends, I wanted to tell you about the Edge Tub from Edge Theory Labs. Their portable and inflatable tub can alternate between an ice bath and hot tub. I've been regenerating the benefits of cold plunging every day, like better sleep, better focus, and more energy. We have had some really amazing interviews to learn more about cold exposure. But in the meantime, I invite you to check out Edge Theory Labs' website to learn more. I'm also happy to share an exclusive offer for Future Generations podcast listeners, $150 off using the code TheFutureGen. You can find more info in the show notes. Get cold. What's up, FG fam? One of the single best companies whose products have supported the optimal wellness of our family for years is Earthly Wellness. Kate TG and her team have stood for truth, health, and freedom in ways that paved the way for so many of us. They experienced heavy levels of censorship long before it was popularized, and they stood strong and persevered. Their products are clean, cost-effective, and honestly, they work for all ages. From supporting my wife, our oldest, and our little guy, Earthly Wellness provides products that have been foundational for our family for years. We especially use their products right before bedtime. Their Feel Better Fast and other herbal tinctures are some of the best in the world, as well as their amazing Goodnight Lotion, the magnesium oil, are mainstays. I am so excited to be partnering with Earthly to offer future generations podcast listeners 10% off your first purchase. You can find the code link in the show notes. Enjoy the rest of the show. Love and appreciate you all. There's so many things there.
Yeah, sorry.
And I would say, for those of you who are new to chiropractic, like that initial story of I don't know who the doc was, but I get it, right? I get it. The visualization of what is possible just when the nervous system is allowed to express more of its full potential. We see it every single day, every age and stage, minutes old babies, pregnant mamas, 99-year-olds. When they have a healthier nervous system, they express more of their fullest potential. But that visualization of like the mass, like that reminds me of BJ's story, just like, just understanding that it's such a small thing, like a subluxation, a misalignment is such a small thing. And the adjustment is so simple. It's so small, but to that person and then to that community and then to the nation and to the world, like that ripple effect is radically dramatic. And to step into that space and be like, hey, let's do this, and then for me, where I get uncomfortable is and most of our listeners, we've been walking down a path where there's this sovereignty thing, right? There's a sovereignty thing of most of our listeners are strategizing at this point for homeschool. They're trying to get their kids outside of the system as much as possible. And a lot of times with that comes like, well, let's just not even pay attention to what that system is doing, because that system largely is maybe imploding. And maybe it's not or maybe that implosion is still catching a ton of kids that we should really care about. And it's not like there are other providers that are stepping into that administrator's office that says, hey, I'd love to do something. And I think it might have a really dramatic transformational possibility for these teachers, right? And then all of a sudden you see it happen, and then the teachers and these admin are like, well, why not the kids? And then this like whole world of possibility opens up. And we know, like it's the back of our mind, that any child that lays on our table for any consecutive period of time and their nervous system is literally reprogrammed habitually for normal, which is healthy, brilliant, and absolutely radically intelligent. Man, God, like every single time, like we don't say expect miracles because it's an adage. We say it because we see them every day and they become like just a part of the day. Mm-hmm. And you get to see that en masse. And then you bring in Heidi, just so people get very clear, because I am that guy. Like Heidi, I met in 2008 in New Zealand. She was wearing a cloak, had a wand. She cursed up a storm, and my buddies and I were literally, if there could be groupies in science, we were groupies of Heidi. And so her studies on prefrontal cortex and the ability for the adjustment to enhance the performance of that specific region of the nervous system that is the seat of your human sovereignty and your executive function, and creating a space between the stimulus and response, whether it's in that victim state versus the victor state, or it's these kids being able to own their lives better in these seats that are largely so challenging for them. You guys are doing some of the most amazing work. And I think it made me so inspired. And I love the fact that we're talking about it, because it pushes my comfort zone to the point where I'm like, I'm creating all these infrastructures to build these new systems and to be facilitating, like, I don't know how many homeschool, like all I did was donate to 2. And then all of a sudden I got so many donation requests. And it's like, oh yeah, let's build that. But let's also recognize that the reason why you're so impactful isn't just because you're amazing, right? The reason why you're so impactful is because of chiropractic. and because of our lens. And because when we can deep dive into the nervous system and deep dive into the root cause, then you make everybody else's job easier because the kids start to do it from the inside out, which is amazing. I love that.
There's a couple of things I want to like piggyback off of what you just said. One, I look at like what we're doing when we adjust someone. It's like they're a violin string, right? And we're just changing the tone so that the harmony comes out is slightly different. And the book that was transformational for me, that is not a chiropractic book, is David Hawkins' work, Power versus Force. And that mixed with the idea that when our tone is different, you know, when we are not afraid anymore, not, you know, bound by shame and grief and guilt and apathy and fear, you know, our genius comes out and our power comes out. And I think that is part of, you know, as children, sometimes no one's taken that away from them, but our culture does a pretty good job sometimes having already like laden them with some of those things.
Of course.
And so, you know, and especially a huge group of the kids that we work with are not kids that would have easily ever found their way into our practice for various reasons. And so I feel strongly about this work, not because I agree with everything that's happening in the public schools. I probably am very much in the same mindset of you and
totally
what's happening in all our structures for that matter. I don't care if it's education, finance, government, religion, you know, like everything is being shook to the core and for good reason. But I also realize that we've got to build bridges out for people. And on some level, you know, here we are in Wisconsin, we don't have as much, you know, challenge as far as like, you know, we still have some of our exemptions and things like that. But the kids that are going to be in the public schools, especially as more of us aren't, you know, are like, they're just left behind on some level too. So I look at it for two things. Number one, I want to serve a population that I'm not going to serve in our practice as easily for, like I said, multiple reasons. And then number two, I think, you know, when we teach children that maybe there's a different way to look at their bodies, maybe not everything is wrong with them, and maybe their genius is there, and maybe it's okay that they can't sit still at school, and maybe there's a reason for that, and like we're just a bright spot in their day, and we're delivering an adjustment to them that they can tell that something's different in them. Now they're a population that in 10, 15, 20 years are adults making decisions, and
I love that.
they know that there's different choices out there that maybe weren't mainstream 10, 20 years ago. And I think that radically shifts things if more schools had access to this, because what's going to happen down the road as those become our adults, as those children become our adults. The other thing that I realized that is sort of like a buzz topic, we got invited down by one of our senators to the Capitol to speak on an opioid task force conversation, because he was like, let's think outside the box here. You know, the children who are at risk at school are not just at risk for like educational issues, but also like what comes later on when we know that, you know, whether addiction is related to something that happened where they got prescribed, you know, some sort of opioid, and then it becomes an addiction issue, or because of the trauma they picked up in their household along the way, and mental health issues and all sorts of things. Like, again, if we can see people much more from a like whole perspective, whole life, instead of like snapshots or segmenting, you know, their care in different ways, which I think chiropractic does a beautiful job of honoring, like there's a mind, body, spirit here. And there's probably genius behind, or at least intelligence behind what's going on, even if it's, you know, undesirable in the symptomatic day-to-day things that are experiencing. So I think that perspective coming into the schools is important, not only for the child individually, but also what happens down the road. And we're able to speak in some of these places where they just, when I say they, I mean, a lot of, like, I had breakfast this morning with that same senator, and I realized that they're curious, and they're almost like sometimes kind of like dumbfounded a little bit about the way we speak about like healthcare and people's potential is like, because unless someone has helped you see it, just like someone helped us see it and
Yeah.
change our mindset of how we look, it's like, that's the part of building bridges for people of like, there are other things out there. And in fact, there's a whole population of people that don't subscribe to a lot of these things anymore because they've done the work to get themselves out of it. But how do we bring even more people across the threshold, which I know you're doing? So
I think that's such an amazing and so important, right? Because I use that analogy all the time, bridges. And everybody, I would say most chiropractors, especially principled chiropractors, philosophically vitalistic based chiropractors, like we know the bridges, like we know all the bridges all the way to the end. And the seed of human like freedom, the expression of our highest potential, gratitude, like a deep-seated purpose in life. Like that's literally what drives like virtually everything that we do. And it takes a certain amount of like literacy to be able to remember all the bridges that we had to cross, and then maybe be able to envision so many of those other bridges. And instead of like going down to the last bridge and pointing back the finger and being like, you back at that last bridge, you're so ignorant, you're not awake. Like, and it's like, that's literally what burns the bridge, that you actually walked over on. And so I appreciate you sharing that, because I feel very much like this to be one of the vehicles, because we have so many patients in our practice who are like, how the heck did they afford care? And then we're like, well, because it's possible for them, then it must be possible for everybody. It's not necessarily true. The truth is that the majority of the population will never go to a chiropractor, especially bring their kids to a chiropractor. And then, like you said, the infrastructure was built for the district. And all it was just adding another, quote, service that we could get into the minutia of what services are, or get into the minutia of insurance-based or not. And we can talk about the whole cartel of the insurance industry, or we can recognize that at the end of the day, it's that child, and it's that family, and it's that nervous system. And I'm curious what your, maybe now that you have done what your mentor asked, which is like, if you could envision, what if these kids knew? And now you're seeing that, what if these kids knew? What is the vision? Like, what do you see happening as a result of the work that you are doing? I would say maybe short term and, into the future.
I'm in my chiropractic island on some level here, but so my vision has a lot to do with like where I believe our enterprise of people are going with this. But
Of course.
my vision and my like certainty, and I, some people would think like I'm nuts for the way that I like think this, but I believe like our vision right now is, I see what's happening in Chibble. I see Heidi Havoc and her team coming in, and I feel convicted around like, when we get this research done, it's going to be a piece of the puzzle. We also recognize like the stories of, what the admin has said and what some of the teachers are saying. We're collecting those too, because those hold just as much weight as the research. They're just different, right? It's like one thing's more subjective and one's more objective. And depending on who we're speaking to, like if you're talking to me, I want to hear the subjective stuff. If you're talking to someone else, they want the objective, right? So we want both. And so our next step is more grassroots. We need like chiropractors, not I'm going to say principled chiropractors, but we need chiropractors who have a heart for this, whether they have a practice or not, that would like to be part of pioneering chiropractic in the schools.
Cool.
And we will help you. And so I don't know if that's 10 locations or more, whether it's done by us or we're just helping you make sure that you have your I's dotted and T's crossed as well, so that there can be more of a lay of the land as far as like we know that this can work, and it's not just happening in Western Wisconsin, it's happening in more places. So I think that's our next click, and one of our desires is that this next year would have 5 other chiropractors engaged in opening the doors in their district. And then, which does not seem that challenging on some level, because we get so many like people reaching out at this point, like wanting to, but we obviously need the right timing, the right people, and all of that. And then where I see it going from there is I see like, yes, I think a lot of the structures as they be are falling, like are changing, and I'm not trying to hold on to them. And at the same time, how soon or fast that happens, because like what is time? I don't know. So, like the school district
Totally.
may be in a public format for our lifetime. I have no idea. And so while it still exists in this format, I would love for us to be part of generationally changing children to understand that their body is self-healing and self-regulating, and they're, intelligent, and they have intelligence within them, and chiropractic is a tool for them. And so what I would love to be a piece of the pie in is, as we pioneer chiropractic into more places and more schools, then we're going to need to transform chiropractic in a way where we can turn out principal chiropractors who could just go and be employed by a school district instead of having to like do what we did to get in
Wow.
there. So the district could just directly employ the chiropractor. And if that's where I'm like, supply and demand is an issue, because if all of a sudden every Division I school in the nation wanted a chiropractor on staff, there's no way we could.
There's no way.
Right. Like there's no way. And so I see that as not too far down the road, which again, people probably think I'm insane when I say that, but it's like, it's not that hard to believe as I watch what's happening around us in this, the smaller districts around Chippewa, that is the bigger district, are all interested. They're all listening. Like, and as one school has success, it's like they want what's best for the kids on a like grassroots level. Like the admin know their kids are like having challenges and their staff is having challenges. And so if we can come with like, this costs you nothing, you have to facilitate it. We, hold the contract, you provide the space. It's kind of like it's too good to be true, which I've had some of the administration say before. It seems too good to be true. Right. So if we could keep this cultivating and grassroots spreading, and then we do have the eye of like a few of our local political people. Now, whether or not the government is involved in this or not, I don't know if that's a good or bad idea yet, but, it's something where I recognize like at some point PT and OT had to become commonplace in school districts. So why not chiropractic? And then, and let's not reinvent the wheel there, even though there may be things about it I don't fully agree with. I'm humble enough to realize that like it spreading doesn't necessarily need to be my idea of how it would go. I'd just like to begin the beginning stages of it to be well, curated so that we get people with the right heart around it, so that it's not, just someone coming in for the wrong reasons kind of thing. So yeah, that's what I see happening.
I love that.
Yeah.
I love that because when the whole kind of world shut down in 2020 and we started to see just the conversations around healthcare. What was elective, and what things were being denied? Like kids didn't go to the pediatrician. Like there were so many things that were just not essential. And you're like, whoa. And then you hear a rumbling of people like who just are just humans navigating this crazy world, that was shutting down. And they're just like, you just start to hear that people are healthier, and they were just then therefore forced to seek out different options. And one of the most common providers that came into our practices, I don't know if this was the same for you, but for us in San Diego was like we had more nurses in our practice than the history of my practice. And not to say that we always did, but then it became this kind of contrast where they saw what their system was doing versus what they knew innately healthcare was, and how obviously the trust level, right, the brand equity of nursing is far superior than any other profession in healthcare. And I see this as the same way, right? Because behind most of these children are sometimes teachers, are sometimes administrators, or sometimes legislators, or sometimes these people of influence in the conventional society structures that don't care about any of that stuff besides the well-being of their kid. And when they speak for the first time, when they have this dramatic transformation that we all know happens every day in our practices, then it doesn't really matter. Like it shouldn't matter, right? Those different discriminations, those different, whatever, factions of healthcare, they just shouldn't matter, because at the end of the day, it's for the child and the family's benefit. And you can see it from the inside out. It's like radically amazing, right? And so I see that also, like chiropractors for sure, we would never be able to serve en masse that population, especially with the right docs in the right seats, right?
Right.
But the other conversation is, for our listeners, you may be thinking about your kid. You may be thinking about your district. You may be thinking about maybe the fact that you're not even in the system, but this is super inspiring, because at the end of the day, it's like, we know the trajectory. We know the trajectory of this epidemic that's affecting our kids, this chronic illness epidemic that conventional healthcare and conventional models of thinking have no idea where the root cause is and no real impact in changing that. You might be inspired to donate. You might be inspired to contribute. You might be inspired to be a part of it. And I'd love to know how people can do that for you guys, Dr.
Sure.
Lona.
So I'm sure in your show notes, we can put the link.
Of course. Yep.
Yeah. So our website is for both parents kind of on the frontward facing, but there's also a part, if we do fundraising for the research. So we had just raised last year $50,000 that should come out this year with our case series that has data from 3 years of pre and post care with chiropractic in the school age population. Yeah, I'm excited for it to come out. And so that should be coming out shortly. But in this next phase, I believe the research team's proposal, and I'd be happy to send you their proposal too if you would like to see it.
Of course.
But that is slated for a year from now, as long as we can get fundraising for it. And we need to raise $350,000 to do the blind study. I double click on what you said there of like, the nurses being in the practice. I think there's been more traditional healthcare people, whether we're talking about NPs, doctors, definitely nurses, who've been in here in the last 4 years. And I'm sure that you would agree with me that I think, even though there's some really horrific things that came out of the last 4 years, we woke up to lots and lots of things that have been there for a long time.
So many. Yeah.
Yeah. And I dare say too, like for our point of view, we have had, kind of hush hush conversations as a profession, chiropractors, whether we're talking about vaccination or the way we birth our children, or, like depending on how gutsy you are, you might announce it, but you might not, or you might have a patient that's like, hey, can I ask you a question? And it's really like hush hush, right? And I felt like part of what was so challenging in 2020 was you went from getting some of those questions like once a week to like once an hour to, and it just like, it felt immensely, like, I don't know, heavy at first. It was like, I'm not sure how to have these conversations in this like frequency, because you're still kind of looking like around, like, is it okay if I'm saying this? And yet then you get a little ballsier, as I know you clearly have. And I realize now, like, there are so many good people who've worked within that system that maybe are still working within it, but don't want to be, or know it's broken, just don't know how to move outside of it. And it goes back to that bridge analogy is like, we have to get our toe in somewhere. And sometimes like chiropractic is for me, like such a great bridge, because a lot of people have heard of chiropractic. They may not really understand it. They may think it's just neck and back pain, but it's mainstream enough that it's not super radical, like, versus if we start talking about some of the other things that we probably all have gone down the rabbit hole, more radical. So I think there's another reason why, we're positioned the way we are in the healthcare scheme right now, where we're like outside of it enough, but yet in it enough that like, we're not super out there, where we can be the first place that people land and then maybe open the next door and the next door and the next door. And I think you're right. It's like trying to love on people and help them through, and know that their timing is going to be their own timing. Right. And that's a hard line sometimes, because you want people to get it or see some of the choices that they're making that continually add to their suffering. But I'm convinced that grassroots things are going to be the way that we move, the model across into something better. So
love it.
I love your conversations. I look at like what's happening here and I just realize it's going to come from people like you and me and other people that just are willing to put the time and the effort in and be uncomfortable and just go, the next step further.
What's one thing you would leave our audience with as an action to take?
I think at first, just in my own action steps is recognizing like, sometimes when you have these visions and you see some of the like inequity and the other side of the coin that can feel really heavy and scary sometimes is like tone is tone, like frequency is frequency. So whether I'm railing against vaccines or railing against anti-vaxxers on the same like tone sphere, it's the same. It's anger, right?
Yep.
And so I check myself as often as I can. And I think it's a good starting place is that we're not going to create a new model in those lower states. We have to get ourselves into like a neutral place or hopefully a loving place or maybe even peace. And that doesn't mean that, if push comes to shove, we're not like sturdy. It just means that I think you can't project out something better, matching it with the same energy.
Wow.
And so that's where I think the power really comes in. And that's why that book is transformational for me, Power versus Forces. I recognize that, when you see radical shifts happen, and this is true for like healing too, like a personal experience, it comes from